Now you will see the Victorian era from its darkest and most unjust side. You had no idea. The Victorian era was not only about gentlemen in top hats and ladies in fluffy dresses talking about the prosperity of the British Empire, but behind the walls of their luxurious mansions, a drama was unfolding that was not customary to talk about. Millions of people lived in a world where day and night merged into an endless 16-hour shift at the factory. In this world, there was no room for error, fatigue, or even a quick chat with a colleague. It was an era of great achievements built on the invisible foundation of human exhaustion. We will look into the glittering ballrooms of the aristocracy and the dimly lit factory floors to understand how these two universes coexisted. Watch the video to the end to learn the true cost of the Industrial Revolution and the invisible rules that forced one part of society to wallow in luxury while the other struggled to survive. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of that time, the transformation of time itself into an instrument of control. For millions of people who came to the cities from the villages, life was no longer measured by sunrises and sunsets. Now their master was the merciless factory whistle, whose sound divided the day into short sleep and endless work. Imagine a world where your day begins long before dawn and ends late at night. 16 hours of monotonous, exhausting labor at the machine was the norm, not the exception. It was time torn from life, devoted to a single purpose: the enrichment of the factory owner. In this system, people became appendages of machines, required only to perform with mechanical precision. Any deviation from the prescribed rhythm was considered a violation. There was no time for reflection or communication, only for movements repeated to the point of automatism. Factory owners, representatives of the new upper middle class, saw this strict order as the key to prosperity. For them, discipline was synonymous with progress, and human fatigue was just an annoying hindrance to production. They sincerely believed in their own righteousness and in the benefits of this world order. Each working day was similar to the previous one, creating a feeling of endless repetition, from whistle to whistle, from one meager meal to another. This routine deprived people not only of their strength, but also of any hope for change in their fate. The contrast between this life and the world of the aristocracy was striking. While some spent 16 hours at the machine, others could devote the whole day to choosing an outfit for the evening ball. These two worlds existed side by side, with virtually no overlap. Punishments for the slightest misdemeanors were an integral part of this system. Being a minute late, taking too long a break, even simply talking at work, all of this was punishable by fines. These fines were not just a disciplinary measure, but another source of income for the factory owner. A worker who was already receiving a meager salary could lose a significant portion of it due to a few minor violations. Often, at the end of the week, he would receive an amount that was barely enough to pay for food and a corner in an overcrowded room. This created a vicious circle of dependence from which it was almost impossible to escape. This system was designed to suppress any will to resist. A tired, perpetually indebted person does not think about their rights. They only think about how to survive until the next day and feed their family. Thus, time control and the penalty system created ideal conditions for exploitation. It was an invisible cage, much more effective than any walls or bars. Do you think there are echoes of such a system of control over workers' time in the modern world? Share your opinion in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about what the slightest carelessness cost a worker? In a Victorian factory, there was no such thing as the human factor or accidental error. There was only a strict set of rules, the violation of which immediately resulted in financial punishment. The penalty system was thought out in detail and covered almost all aspects of a worker's behavior. Being even 1 minute late for work meant a deduction from your pay. If a worker arrived 5 minutes late, they could lose an hour's pay for their exhausting labor. Any conversation not related to the production process was prohibited. Overseers, who were recruited from the lower middle class, kept a close eye on the workers. Any employee caught in idle conversation was immediately fined an amount that was significant for them. Even natural human needs became grounds for punishment. Staying too long in the restroom or trying to sit down and rest for a few minutes was punished as severely as being late. It was believed that every second of working time should be paid for with labor. Product quality was controlled just as strictly. Any defect, even the most insignificant one, caused by carelessness or fatigue, resulted in a fine. Sometimes the amount of the fine could exceed the cost of the damaged part itself. Many factory owners posted lists of rules in a prominent place, and this list could contain dozens of items. There were fines for dirty clothes, for an untidy machine, for tools left behind. This system created an atmosphere of constant tension and fear. The working class lived in a state of permanent debt to their employer. It was often the case that after all deductions for the week, a person received only a small part of what they had actually earned. This made them even more dependent on their job. For the middle class, who managed these processes, such a system seemed fair. They believed that strict discipline and the inevitability of punishment instilled responsibility in workers. This was part of their philosophy of respectability and order. The workers themselves perceived this system as legalized robbery, but they had virtually no opportunity to protest. Any sign of discontent could lead to immediate dismissal and blacklisting. This constant financial stranglehold was a powerful tool of oppression. It forced people to work to the limit of their abilities, fearing not so much physical punishment as the prospect of being left without a means of subsistence. Is such a system fair, where one person's mistake becomes a source of income for another? Now imagine that while millions of people lived in fear of being fined for breathing too deeply, a completely different life was unfolding in another part of London. In the next chapter, we will take a look behind the scenes of the aristocratic world, where the main problem was finding entertainment to relieve boredom. What I am about to show you was hidden behind the high fences of aristocratic estates. While the working class struggled to survive, the British aristocracy lived in a completely different reality, subject to their own rules, which were no less strict but absolutely meaningless. Their day was not dictated by the factory whistle, but by a series of rituals designed to fill the void. An aristocrat's morning began late, with a breakfast that could consist of a dozen dishes. After that, the men went to their clubs, where they discussed politics, horse racing, and the state of affairs in distant colonies. Slaves on plantations were just an abstract source of income for them, not living people. Women of high society spent their time visiting, trying on new dresses, and organizing dinner parties. Their lives were governed by the most complex etiquette. Incorrectly chosen gloves or a wrongly spoken word could lead to social ostracism. Lunch was the main event of the day, a real theatrical performance. The menu could include up to 20 courses, from oysters and soups to several types of meat, game, and the most complex desserts. They ate slowly, for hours, turning the meal into a social event. It was customary to eat until satiated and then retire to special rooms to relieve the stomach and continue the meal. This was not considered shameful, but a sign of wealth and the ability to afford any excesses. Such an approach would have shocked any member of the working class, for whom food was merely a means of sustaining strength. Evenings were devoted to balls, operas, and receptions. It was a world of glamour, where the cost of a single lady's jewelry could equal the annual income of a small factory. Here, marriages were concluded, intrigues were spun, and political issues were decided. Members of the titled nobility and gentry had virtually no contact with the world of commoners. They lived in their estates and London mansions, surrounded by an army of servants. The dirt and poverty of the industrial districts were something distant and almost unreal to them. Their income came from owning land leased to farmers or from investments in industrial enterprises and colonial trade. They did not see the production process, but only received profits. This allowed them to maintain peace of mind and discuss morality without noticing its violation right under their noses. This idle life of excess was the flip side of the Industrial Revolution. The luxury of some was directly paid for by the exhausting labor of others. The two classes that existed in one country actually lived on different planets. It was this detachment from reality that gave rise to the famous Victorian morality. The aristocracy, not faced with a harsh struggle for survival, could afford to discuss lofty matters. They created a world of strict rules and propriety that was completely inapplicable to the lives of those who ensured their well-being. Guess what was the main driving force for those who were neither aristocrats nor workers? Between these two poles existed a rapidly growing and very heterogeneous middle class. Its representatives desperately sought one thing: respectability. The upper middle class consisted of successful industrialists, bankers, doctors, and lawyers. They may have been richer than many aristocrats, but they did not have titles or centuries-old estates. Therefore, they tried to compensate for this with an emphatically strict lifestyle. Their homes were bastions of order and morality. They valued work, family, and religion. Unlike the aristocracy, they did not despise work. On the contrary, they saw it as the source of their wealth and status. They were the main bearers and defenders of Victorian values. For them, respectability meant financial stability, an impeccable reputation, and strict adherence to social norms. Any hint of scandal could destroy their position. Below them on the social ladder was the lower middle class. Clerks, teachers, small traders. They lived in constant fear. They were afraid of slipping back into the working class, from which many of them had come. Their salaries were not much higher than those of skilled workers, but they wore frock coats and hats instead of work clothes. This appearance was a symbol of their belonging to a higher world. They tried their best to emulate the upper middle class. They bought furniture on credit and tried to give their children an education. Their lives were filled with anxiety about what people would say. It was often members of the middle class who became factory managers and overseers. They were the ones who introduced and enforced the harsh system of penalties. In doing so, they proved their loyalty to the owners and separated themselves from the lazy and undisciplined working masses. For them, the working class was not just poor people, but bearers of vice. They saw their poverty not as a consequence of exploitation, but as a result of their own laziness and immorality. This helped them justify the existing order of things. Thus, the middle class acted as a buffer between the aristocracy and the workers. It was both the engine of progress and the main guardian of cruel rules. Their desire for respectability cemented social inequality. But what were the living conditions like for those at the bottom of this hierarchy? In the next chapter, you will learn about the daily life of a Victorian worker. The daily life of the working class was completely subordinated to the rhythm of the industrial city. Their homes were not cozy mansions, but overcrowded apartment buildings, known as tenements. These buildings were constructed quickly and cheaply, with the sole purpose of accommodating as many people as possible. An entire family would often huddle together in one small room. There was no separation into a bedroom, kitchen, or living room. All of life took place in one cramped, poorly ventilated space. Sanitary conditions were appalling. Amenities, if any, were located in the courtyard and were shared by dozens of families. This posed a constant health hazard, but it was not customary to think about it. The air in industrial areas was heavy with coal smoke. Black soot covered everything: buildings, clothes, and penetrated the lungs. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the smog, which meant that the workers' neighborhoods were perpetually in semi-darkness. Food was scarce and monotonous. The diet consisted mainly of bread, potatoes, and cheap tea. Meat was rarely served, except on major holidays, and was considered a real luxury. The working day began in the dark and ended the same way. People had virtually no time for leisure or rest. The short hours between work and sleep were spent on household chores and attempts to regain strength. Despite the harsh conditions, it was in these neighborhoods that a sense of community was born. Neighbors helped each other and shared their last piece of bread. This mutual assistance was one of the few bright spots in their lives. Pubs were the main center of social life. Here, men could have a pint of ale after work, discuss the news, and simply escape from the harsh reality. It was the only public space available to them. Women had it even harder. In addition to working in the factory, they were responsible for all the housework and caring for the family. Their working day was truly endless. Such a life left little hope for the future. The children of workers began working at an early age, repeating the fate of their parents. It was almost impossible to break out of this cycle. What if I told you that for some, factory work did not seem like the worst option? Deep underground in the coal mines, there was a world even more dangerous and exhausting. The work of a miner was considered one of the hardest in the entire empire. A miner's working day was spent in complete darkness, lit only by the dim light of an oil lamp. They descended underground before sunrise and did not return to the surface until after sunset. Many of them did not see daylight for months. Working conditions were incredibly cramped. Miners had to work in narrow, low tunnels, often lying on their sides or bent over double. Every swing of the pickaxe required enormous physical effort. The air in the mines was stale and filled with coal dust. This led to chronic lung problems. Over time, miners' breathing became wheezy and labored. There was a constant threat of cave-ins and methane explosions. Every descent into the mine was a risk from which there might be no return. Work safety was the last thing on the minds of mine owners. The work was not only hard, but also monotonous. Hour after hour, day after day, miners chipped away at coal and loaded it into carts. This work required tremendous endurance and patience. Miners were paid piecework wages. They were paid for the amount of coal they extracted. This forced them to work to the limit of their strength, often neglecting basic safety precautions. Miners often lived in settlements that belonged to the same company as the mine. They rented housing from the company and bought food at its store at inflated prices. This created an additional bondage from which there was no escape. Despite all the difficulties, the miners were incredibly united. The danger they faced every day created a special brotherhood. They knew that underground, they could only count on each other. Their labor was the foundation of the Industrial Revolution. Coal was the fuel for the steam engines that powered factories, trains, and ships. But the creators of this power lived in poverty and obscurity. Can such progress be considered justified? In the next chapter, we will discuss what awaited those who could not even find such work. At the very bottom of Victorian society were those who were called the subclass. They were the poor, the homeless, people without steady work. Their world was the slums of London's East End, a place that respectable citizens feared and avoided. These people did not even have a 16-hour working day because they had no work at all. Their life consisted of a daily struggle for a piece of bread. They lived on odd jobs, charity, or theft. Their homes were night shelters, where for a few pennies they could sleep on a bare bench. In the morning, they were kicked out onto the street, and the search for a livelihood began again. They had no possessions except the clothes they wore. To combat poverty, the government created workhouses, but conditions in them were deliberately made worse than the life of the lowest paid worker. This was done to scare away idlers. Once in a workhouse, a person was deprived of all civil rights. Families were separated. Men, women, and children were housed in different buildings. They could go months without seeing each other, even though they lived under the same roof. The work in such houses was hard and meaningless. Plucking tow, crushing stones. All this was done not to produce something useful, but to occupy the time and energy of the inhabitants. They were fed a meager, monotonous diet. Society saw these people not as victims of circumstance, but as a threat. They were considered lazy, depraved, and dangerous. The middle class feared them, and the aristocracy simply preferred to ignore their existence. For many women from this class, prostitution became the only way to survive. The streets of London at night were full of fallen women selling themselves for pennies. It was a desperate attempt to avoid starvation. This segment of society was the focus of social reformers and philanthropists. They tried to help by opening soup kitchens and shelters, but their efforts were a drop in the ocean of systemic poverty. The existence of this bottom was an important element of Victorian society. It served as a constant scarecrow for the working class. Every worker knew that dismissal could send him into the terrifying world of the East End, and this made him cling to his job. The main question arises, how did people survive in such inhuman conditions? In addition to obvious physical endurance, they had their own social and cultural mechanisms of adaptation. It was these mechanisms that helped them preserve their humanity in a world of machines and poverty. One of the main mechanisms was the neighborhood community. In overcrowded houses, everyone knew each other. If someone was in trouble, neighbors came to help, sharing food or money. Mutual aid funds played an important role. Workers in the same workshop or factory would contribute a small amount each week to a common fund. If someone was unable to work, they would receive a small allowance from this money, which allowed them to avoid starvation. Songs and humor were another way to cope with reality. Workers sang at work if it was not prohibited and in pubs after work. In these songs, they mocked their overseers, factory owners, and their difficult lot, which provided emotional relief. Despite their fatigue, people found time for simple entertainment. Sunday was the only day off, and they tried to make the most of it. Families went for walks in parks, if there were any nearby. Traditions and rituals brought from village life helped to maintain a connection with the past. Celebrating Christmas or Easter, even in the most modest circumstances, was an important event. It served as a reminder that life was not just about work. For many, religion served as a source of comfort. Preachers from nonconformist churches, such as the Methodists, often came from the same working-class background. Their sermons gave people hope for a better life, if not on earth, then in heaven. Gradually, workers began to realize their collective strength. The first trade unions began to appear. They fought for shorter working hours, higher wages, and better working conditions by organizing strikes and walkouts. These associations were brutally suppressed by the authorities and factory owners. But the very idea that together they could achieve something gave people strength. It was the birth of a new class consciousness. Thus, survival was not only a physical but also a social process. Mutual aid, culture, and the first attempts to fight for their rights. All this allowed the working class not to turn into a faceless mass, but to remain a community of people. If the situation of working class men was difficult, the lives of women were even more difficult. They were under double oppression as workers and as women. Victorian society imposed special, invisible chains on them. In factories, women often did the same work as men. However, they were paid significantly less for it. It was believed that men were the main breadwinners, while women's labor was only auxiliary. Their labor was especially valued in the textile industry. Their thin and nimble fingers were considered ideal for working on spinning and weaving machines. Women stood for hours in noisy and stuffy workshops, performing monotonous work. After a 16-hour shift at the factory, a second shift awaited them at home. Washing, cooking, cleaning, caring for the family, all this fell on their shoulders. There was practically no rest in their lives. Even in the upper echelons of society, the position of women was unenviable. Aristocrats or factory owners' daughters did not work at machines, but their lives were strictly regulated. Their main task was to marry well and bear heirs. They had no right to their own opinion in politics or business. Their education was superficial and limited to languages, music, and housekeeping. They were beautiful additions to their husbands, but not independent personalities. After marriage, all of a woman's property became the sole property of her husband. She could not dispose of money or conclude transactions without his consent. In essence, she became his property. Victorian morality required women to be angels in the home. They had to be meek, submissive, and completely devoted to their families. Any deviation from this role was strictly condemned by society. For women from the lower classes, these moral standards were simply a mockery. They could not be angels in the home because they were forced to work alongside men, but at the same time, society still judged them by the same strict rules. Thus, regardless of social class, women in the Victorian era were in a subordinate position, whether it was a factory workshop or the gilded cage of an aristocratic mansion. It was a society built by men and for men. Despite all the darkness and injustice, it was during the Victorian era that the seeds of a future, more just society were sown. The system, which seemed unshakable, gradually began to crack. This was thanks to the efforts of a wide variety of people. Reformist writers such as Charles Dickens emerged. In his novels, he vividly and truthfully described the lives of the poor and the conditions in workhouses and factories. His books were read by everyone and made even wealthy people think about what was happening around them. Journalists and public figures conducted their own investigations. They went down into mines, infiltrated slums, and published shocking reports in newspapers. Society could no longer ignore the problem by pretending it did not exist. Philanthropists from among the wealthy began to donate money to build hospitals, schools, and housing for the poor. Their actions were a drop in the ocean, but they showed that compassion was not dead. It was a manifestation of growing social responsibility. Reformist politicians in Parliament began to promote the first labor laws. At first, they were very timid, but the very fact of their appearance was a breakthrough. Acts were passed limiting the length of the working day. The trade union movement grew stronger, despite opposition from the authorities. Workers realized that strikes were a powerful weapon. Mass strikes could bring entire industries to a halt and force owners to make concessions. The scientific worldview was also changing. The emergence of theories about germs and the spread of disease forced city authorities to think about sanitation. The construction of water supply and sewage systems began, which gradually improved living conditions. Discussions about women's rights began in society. The first suffragettes appeared, demanding voting rights for women. It was a long and difficult road, but it began at that very moment. The Industrial Revolution itself, which caused so much suffering, also created the conditions for change. It brought millions of people together in cities where ideas spread more quickly. It created a working class that eventually realized its power. Thus, the Victorian era was a time not only of great contrasts, but also of great change. The cruel system of exploitation itself gave rise to the forces that ultimately led to its transformation. This painful experience became an important lesson for all of humanity. We have taken a journey into the world of Victorian England, seeing not only the splendor of the empire, but also its dark underbelly. 16-hour workdays, a system of fines, and enormous social inequality were as much a part of the era as steam engines and lavish balls. It was a reality in which survival required superhuman efforts, and the price of progress was measured in millions of emaciated lives. The history of this period shows how society can exist in a state of extreme contradiction, where the luxury of some is built on the deprivation of others. But it also demonstrates the strength of the human spirit, the ability to help one another and fight for one's rights even in the most hopeless circumstances. Studying this past helps us to better understand many of the social processes that are taking place today. What other historical eras or events would you like to see in our next episodes? Perhaps you are interested in the life of gladiators in ancient Rome or the secrets of medieval guilds. Leave your suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos.